welcome to the Newsmakers Review the Week, when we look back at the best of the past 7 days here on the show. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll take you through the stories we dissected and debated, disagreed on and mulled over. It was the week that saw Venezuela's opposition win big in parliamentary polls, the week that saw the Front National take center stage in France's regional elections, and the week that saw Syria's opposition groups come together in Riyadh to try and find a united front. But let's start with South America. On Monday, our newsmaker was Chavismo, as we asked if the end was nigh for Hugo Chávez's socialist dream. Sandra Gartman was in her native Venezuela and sent us this report.
This was a moment 17 years in the making. Supporters of Venezuela's political opposition celebrating a landslide win in parliament for the first time. The promise of change finally in their grasp. Despite a swing in support for the opposition, Nicolás Maduro remains president. In the lead-up to elections, he encouraged supporters to take to the streets if the opposition won. But the president accepted Sunday's defeat.
Con nuestra moral, con nuestra ética, a reconocer.
I recognize these adverse results and accept them, and tell our Venezuela that the Constitution and democracy have won.
Decirle a nuestra Venezuela.
Sunday's parliamentary elections may spell a new dawn for politics in the country. Venezuela has struggled to shake the ever-present memory of late President Hugo Chávez, whose socialist revolution won the loyalty of much of the country's poor through social programs. But his successor, Nicolás Maduro, has seen his popularity slide as former Chávez loyalists become disillusioned with Venezuela's collapsing economy and climbing crime rate. Sunday's election saw a high turnout, with millions of Venezuelans flocking to polling booths guarded by soldiers to elect new members into the 167-seat parliament. Many were inspired by a sense of duty.
Para mí es sumamente importante el estar aquí y el llegar a esa hora.
For me, it's very important to be here today for my country, for Venezuela, for my children, for all those people who want to go forward.
Today we're gambling the pension of our elderly. We're gambling everything the government is giving us for the people. The right wing has never given the people anything.
The streets of central Caracas were unusually quiet on Sunday, except for armed soldiers. With tensions high on both sides of the political divide, accusations of intimidation flew. In the slums, where half of the city's residents live, we saw a gang of young men on motorcycles beep their horns and carry the flag of the ruling party. While in the suburb of Jardines del Valle, opposition supporters heckles the mayor of Caracas, a Maduro loyalist. But the opposition insists it won't be looking for a battle in Congress.
We're
going to the National Assembly, not to take revenge. We're going to discuss. But there's discussion. Another thing is impunity. We have to respond to wrongdoing. But we aren't going to go to the National Assembly and do what they did.
This is truly a historic win for the opposition in Venezuela. It's the first time in 17 years they've won a majority in parliament. They're chanting the national anthem of Venezuela. This is really a special time for the people in this room. But after celebrations die down, the hard work begins to unite a deeply divided nation, an effort which will have to begin inside Congress. Sandra Gartman, TRT World, Caracas.
Gregory Wilpert, author of Changing Venezuela by Taking Power, the History and Policies of the Chavez Government, joined me on the Newsmakers from Caracas in the aftermath of the result. I asked him if he thought the election result was a good day for Venezuela.
Well, it depends on which side you are on. For the Chavistas, obviously, this is the worst day. The thing is, certainly the economic shortages and the inflation have been battering everyone here, both Chavista and the other side. And now, of course, both sides would certainly be hoping that a major change in direction in the economic policy will be taken so that, the inflation and the shortages come to a stop. So that, in that sense, I think the possibility of that happening is certainly a good day for everyone. But the possibility of losing the political project that President Chavez started is certainly the worst of days for the Chavistas and obviously a good day for the opposition.
Gregory, where did they go wrong, the Chavistas?
Well, it's difficult to say, I think, because the project that President Chavez started back in 1999 had brought about a lot of positive changes for the country, particularly with reducing poverty. But one of the things that it also brought about was tremendous amount of resistance, which caused Chavez to back then introduce a currency control in order to stop capital flight. And that currency control, I think, is the root of the problems that Venezuela is suffering through now. That is, the currency control was kept for a very long time, creating a massive black market for dollars, which ended up distorting the economy tremendously. And so it kind of depends on which side you're on. But I would say that that the root of the problem is really trying trying to introduce this political project in a context of tremendous amount of resistance that had caused these, that led to these economic problems.
Now, on Tuesday, in the wake of the San Bernardino shooting, and just days after U.S. President Barack Obama labeled the attack that left 14 people dead terrorism, we looked at exactly what that word means. Is a moment intended to terrorize terrorism? The Newsmakers' Duncan Crawford filed this report on the definition of the word.
What is terrorism? Terrorism is a term that's been defined in many ways, but that is also hard to explain.
Terrorism.
Terrorist.
Terrorist. Terrorists terrorize us into being afraid.
Terrorist.
Daesh.
How to fight terrorism, not whether to fight terrorism.
The Oxford English Dictionary says terrorism is the unofficial or unauthorised use of violence and intimidation in the pursuit of political aims. Bombings, violence against the state and mass murder have all been described as terrorist acts. Yet who and what is terrorism is often disputed, as is the best way to fight it. The aftermath of a mass shooting that killed 14 people in the US. This married couple opened fire at an office in California and were later killed by police. The FBI is investigating links to Daesh.
The two of them had gone down the dark path of radicalization, embracing a perverted interpretation of Islam that calls for war against America and the West. They had stockpiled assault weapons, ammunition, and pipe bombs. So this was an act of terrorism.
The murders have re-energized debate about the term terrorist and when to use it. Just days earlier, 3 people were gunned down at a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado. This man's accused of the murders. Abortion rights groups have spoken out.
We believe they're acts of domestic terrorism, and we believe that they should be investigated and prosecuted as such.
And earlier this year, the US authorities accused this man, Dylan Roof, of committing a hate crime, not terrorism, after he murdered 9 people at a black church in Charleston. Different legal systems and government agencies use different definitions for terrorism. The FBI defines it as the unlawful use of force to intimidate or coerce a government. The UN says terrorism is criminal acts intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public, while in Iraq it's to cause terror among people, frighten them or cause danger to their lives. The differences make it difficult to define what a terrorist act is. Many Arabs accuse the Israelis of terrorism in their actions towards the Palestinians. Israel rejects that and has long argued it is fighting a war against terrorists. The US says Syria, Iran and Sudan are all state sponsors of terrorism. Those countries disagree and have accused the US of committing acts of terror. And groups which some have defined as terrorists sometimes later become political parties with varying degrees of acceptance. Sinn Féin, previously known as the political wing of the IRA, is now one of the most popular political parties in Northern Ireland, while Hezbollah is represented in Lebanon's parliament, but is still classified as a terror group by the US, UK and others. The debate about who is a terrorist and who is a freedom fighter has gone on for decades, with politicians, pundits and the media using the terms for many different groups and individuals. Outrage towards Daesh and its continued slaughter and torture in Syria and Iraq has recently united the world against them. But how to classify other rebel groups fighting against the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is a more difficult question. Duncan Crawford, The Newsmakers.
Well, I was joined on Tuesday's edition of The Newsmakers by Phil Rees. He's the author of Dining with Terrorists, Meeting the World's Most Wanted Militants, and has spent a lot of time living alongside groups who are considered terrorists. Here's what he had to say when I asked him if an ideological connection instead of an operational connection to a terror group can make someone a terrorist.
Of course, in the classic sense, when the intelligence community is talking about terrorist groups or when the United States talks about its list of foreign terrorist organizations, it assumes a control and command structure, it assumes a leader, and it assumes a sort of body of people. Now, you know, clearly what's happening now is that an idea is so potent that is emanating from Daesh. That assumes that these people had no links, of course, with them in those classical sense. And if that's to be understood, then there are people around the world who are basically acting on their own will, according to their own anger, their own motives, without any such structure. I mean, I would say that it doesn't actually make much difference. It's political violence. And there is political violence around the world. But when you start using the word political violence, those who adhere to the term terrorism, because terrorism invokes the horror and condemnation that is usually attributed to such acts, if you try to use the word political violence, people say, well, you're an apologist because this actually has a political cause. Well, I would say, if you're going to go down that road, you're being pretty ineffective in trying to reach a cause to what's going on, to try to explain what's going on. Because if you simply say these people are like crazy, then fine, I would agree that isn't an act of political violence. But if there is a causation, and we want to stop this, as we certainly should, then we need to address the causes of it.
Tuesday's newsmaker was France's Front National leader Marine Le Pen. Regional elections saw a dramatic swing to the far right. Some said it was a knee-jerk reaction to the November 13th attacks in Paris. Others said it was a sentiment already entrenched after economic woes and a faltering trust in the EU. The newsmaker's Yvette McCullough explored in her report if we're seeing a new era for European politics.
For the first time, the far right appears to be on the brink of power in regional France. The National Front recently finished ahead in 6 out of 13 regions in the first round of elections. Its leader, Marine Le Pen, is anti-immigration and anti-Europe. She has tried to reinvent the party, appealing to voters who are voiceless and disenfranchised. The regional elections were the first test of voter sentiment since the attacks last month in Paris that killed 130 people.
The support to the Front National grows stronger every election. Political leaders will try to find excuses because they're unable to question themselves. This time, they will use the terrorist attacks in Paris to justify this historical result.
The National Front's success is already changing the political dynamic in France. Prime Minister Manuel Valls has urged his Socialist Party supporters to vote strategically for the centre-right in the next round and has pulled out some of his candidates to avoid splitting the vote. He says the far right is a force that will divide France and that must be stopped. Provocative images, nationalist rhetoric, angry exchanges. When it comes to the far right, though, it's not just France. This is Dresden in eastern Germany, a country where many of those views have been practically outlawed since the end of the Second World War. This is the street movement Pegida, patriotic Europeans against Islamization of the West.
What worries me most is that Germany has been taken over. I live in Berlin, and when I take public transportation, the bus or subway, I see more and more foreigners.
Refugees can come when they come from a country at war, but what's happening here in Germany is an Islamic invasion.
Although not a force at the ballot box, Pegida's growing popularity highlights the rise of the far right across Europe. And in many countries, the draw of the right has translated into votes. In the last European parliamentary elections, France's National Front won 23 seats. Italy's Northern League gained 5. The Freedom Party in Austria took 4, as did the Dutch Party of Freedom. Some members of the centre-right and centre-left are struggling to define their message, and their reforms are failing to pull in enough votes. Charismatic politicians leading the far right are offering a slicker image, their policies less extreme than before, and they're attracting voters who seem to be tired of the mainstream. Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Last week we saw Syrian opposition and rebel groups meet in Riyadh, where they attempted to agree on a united front of delegates to send to future peace talks. Global powers want Syrians to sit down and draw up a peace plan before 2015 is out. On Thursday, our newsmaker was perhaps the main sticking point in those talks, Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. We look back at the many attempts at peace that preceded this latest round of talks. In March 2011, civil unrest broke out in Syria. The Arab League tried to stop the escalating violence and crack down on protests. In December that year, it dispatched an observer mission, but it was disbanded after only a month. In February 2012, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan became special envoy to Syria and proposed a 6-point peace plan. Both sides accepted the deal, and a ceasefire took effect in mid-April. But by May, it had fallen apart. June 2012 saw the start of the first major peace talks known as Geneva I. They called for a transitional government that would include members of the current regime. But there were no preconditions, and talks collapsed. And a frustrated Kofi Annan resigned. In August, new Special Envoy to Syria, Lakhdar Brahimi, tried unsuccessfully to revive talks. He failed, famously saying he was terribly sorry. In January 2013, Assad outlined his own plan to end the fighting, but the opposition rejected it outright. And a year later, in January 2014, a second round of talks were held in Geneva. The opposition said for peace to happen, Assad had to go. Since then, there's been no real sign of peace. At the end of September, Russia stepped up its military support of Assad's forces, bolstering his position and potentially changing the game over whether Assad will be a part of a transitional peace. With the refugee crisis increasing the urgency for a solution, another round of talks, the so-called Vienna process, began in October. They agreed on a political process starting in Syria in January and leading to elections in 2 years. This week, opposition politicians and rebels met for the first time to try and agree a common position to take to the next round of talks in New York later this month. The US, UN and Russia are also due to meet in Vienna on Friday to discuss the framework and the architecture for a ceasefire. But away from the roundtables, a ceasefire between rebels and the Syrian government on the ground in Homs. On Wednesday, rebels began evacuating the last district they controlled in what was once seen as the capital of Syria's Arab Spring Revolution. Some say this approach, direct negotiations between Syrians, could be the most effective way to gradually bring peace. But for others, it's seen as forced surrender. On Thursday's program, we were joined by Abdelaziz Al-Mashi, co-founder of Syria Solidarity Movement UK, and Stop the War Coalition's Stephen Bell. Take a look at what happened when I asked Al-Mashi if he would accept Bashar al-Assad in any way, shape or form as part of the solution, and the debate that his response triggered.
Absolutely not, because Assad is the main cause for the problem in Syria. What we will see, what will we say to the mothers, the children of the victims who have been killed by Assad? Assad is the main cause for the problem. Like more than 250,000 people have been killed because of him. And again, if you look at the peace talks in the past, Assad was presented there, and even his allies, the Iranians and the Russians, and we made it clear he has no future in Syria. But again, this is up to the Syrian people to decide whether they will accept Assad or not. It is not up to stop the war or to the international community. And the Syrian people from the beginning, when they came down to the streets in hundreds of thousands, they said, okay, Assad must go. He should listen to the people and he must go. Assad has no intention to leave, and Assad made it clear. He said, look, it is me. I stay on my position, or I will ban the country. And this is exactly what he did. Because if he really cared about the Syrian people, if he really cared about Syria, we wouldn't have reached the point where all of the Syrian cities has been destroyed, where we have now extremism in Syria. He didn't listen to anyone, and he just wanted to keep his position. And this is, we made it very clear. Assad has no future in Syria, and he must leave. This is one. The other thing, when it comes to Stop the War coalition, the Stop the War coalition have never criticized Assad or his massacres. Actually, what they did, they criticized the Saudi intervention in Yemen, and they organized the demonstrations outside the Saudi embassy. They criticized the coup of Sisi in Egypt, and they organized a demo outside the Egyptian embassy. They failed to criticize Assad. They failed to criticize the Iranian intervention in my country, and they failed to organize one demonstrations outside the Russian embassy, who have been heavily involved against the Syrian people, who have been heavily involved in supporting Assad militarily, politically, and financially. And we even called them, okay, like, come. And because in London we have a demo outside the Russian embassy since the start of the Syrian revolution. They never joined us, despite we called them to do so. In their event, in their demonstrations, even recently, when they launched the campaign Don't Bomb Syria, they called pro-Assad speakers to speak on their platform, and they literally dismissed us. They denied us. They don't want to listen to us. Even their statement, your guest has been talking about a statement against the Russians' intervention in Syria. They actually wrote a statement like days after the Russians' intervention, and after a campaign from our side. We said, look, like what is your position over the Russians' intervention? They found themselves in a position, like very weak positions, and that's why they came up with this statement.
Okay, passionately put there. Steve Bell, where's that energy that Stop the War coalition has to protest against Sisi and Saudi and others? Where's that energy to protest against the Russians and protest against the Syrians?
The actions against the demonstrations referred to were called by the Yemeni community and by the Egyptian community in London. They did not originate from Stop the War.
Yeah, but
in general,
you attached yourself to it. Here's a Syrian telling you that they called you to protest against the Russians and to protest against Assad with them, and you did not. Why?
The British government is supporting the Saudi war upon Yemen. The British government is supporting the maintenance of General Sisi as a dictator in Egypt. We are opposing British government policy.
So that's it?
Yes, that is our function. We are a political campaign in Britain, and our focus is upon the actions of the British government. Like your other guest indicated, we believe that the future of Syria should be entirely in the hands of the people of Syria.
Okay, I'm going to give, and talking again about the people of Syria, Abdulaziz, I'm going to give you the final 20 seconds here because we have run out of time. Please, very briefly.
I just want to say something to Stephen. Like me, myself, and many Syrians used to be big fans for Stop the War Coalition, but Stop the War Coalition failed us. Stop the War Coalition failed to criticize the massacres of Assad against our people. Stop the War Coalition failed to take their responsibility as anti-war movement to ask Assad to stop his war against the Syrian people. Stop the War Coalition failed to criticize the Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah for their crimes against the Syrian people. And again, Stop the War Coalition don't want to listen to us. We have been trying very hard to negotiate with Stop the War Coalition to clarify their position to Syria, but they never listened to us.
Well, that was the week that was, from shifting politics in France and Venezuela to defining the word terrorism and examining the future political options for Syria. We've debated, analyzed and scrutinized the stories in the headlines and those behind them too. Next week, we'll be looking at human rights in Saudi Arabia as women both stand and vote in elections for the first time ever. You've been watching the Newsmakers Review the Week with me, Imran Garta. I'll be back on Monday, but for now, from me and the rest of the Newsmakers team, bye-bye.